Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support listening with China Blue. Timothy Myers is one of America's most versatile conductors, engaging collaborators and innovative purveyors of ideas. A frequent collaborator with leading opera companies and orchestras, he is internationally acclaimed for his eloquence, energy, command, and unbridled curiosity across a wide range of repertoire and projects. In September of 2023, Myers was appointed music director of the Spoleto Festival USA Orchestra, one of the world's most prestigious ensembles for early career classical musicians. In this role, Myers leads the annual formation of the orchestra, which serves as the backbone of Spoleto's ambitious multidisciplinary festivals, and conducts multiple performances of symphonic programs, operas, and other special projects. Myers also serves as the Sarah and Ernest Butler Music Director at Austin Opera. A leading voice in the topics of leadership and innovation, Myers has recent speaking appearances at the SXSW Festival, Harvard Business School, the University of Texas at Austin, and Miami Dade College. Myers is also the host of Listening on Purpose podcast, an exploration of listening and connecting through the lenses of notable guests such as authors Seth Godin and Chip Conley, neuroscientist Dr. Nina Kraus, and top TEDx contributor Julian Treasure. Myers champions the next generation of conductors, instrumentalists, and composers of today, and as an orchestral conductor, he collaborates internationally. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you, China. Nice to be with you today.
Nice to speak with you after all this time.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, it was so nice of you to have me on your podcast. And I guess that was like a bit of a time ago. But during that time, you continue your work as a conductor.
Yeah, it's actually gotten busier, and my podcast is unfortunately on a little bit of a hiatus right now, or a pause, I should say, just because, my real job got in the way a little bit.
I hate that when that happens.
Yeah, such is life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking that since not many people know about your work and what it entails, if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a conductor and how listening is involved.
I will start by just giving everyone a little bit of context about what it is, the job of being a conductor. Um, it is a lot of study, because obviously, if I'm going to lead large numbers of people in something, I need to understand it as deeply as possible. So a large part of my life is score study
Hmm.
and learning and ingesting. and trying to understand as deeply as possible the scores that I'm conducting. So, for example, this week I'm conducting performances of Verdi's Requiem Mass. And so, this is a very large piece. It's, 85 minutes, very large orchestra, very large chorus. And so it, it takes hours and hours and hours and hours to really learn a score like this and to understand it so that when I'm standing on the podium, I can do a number of things that are involved in the job of being a conductor. The first one, and to me, the most important part is all of these musicians on stage are looking at their part, right? So
Right.
the violinists see the violin one or two part, trombone sees trombone one, two, three part, whatever it is. The chorister sees soprano, alto, tenor, bass. I'm the one who sees the whole picture. So I have the score that has everyone's part in it,
Uh-huh.
and it's my responsibility to give them information that they don't know.
Hmm.
So looking at their part, they can see, okay, these are the notes I'm supposed to play. This is the dynamic, meaning how loud or how soft that it's supposed to be. There might be things like articulation, which means how short or long is a note. And so there's a lot of information for them in that part. But these are very talented, experienced musicians, right? So they know what all of these things mean. What that doesn't tell them is how it goes together necessarily. So
Ah.
so my job is to create something that is greater than the sum of the parts by illuminating to them how all of these different pieces go together in in pursuit of a greater vision. So that is the chief job of a conductor. And I know, when people think about watching a conductor, many people say, well, what does a conductor actually do? And in what I just described to you, to me, is the chief responsibility of being on the podium and having that privilege. Um, the process that happens on the podium is a different, quite complex step. Because as I just described, if I'm looking to portray a greater and cohesive vision to all of these individuals, that means I have to have a very firm vision in my mind of what that is. So what does it look like? How is this going to go? How do I want this to sound, right? Is there a certain color that the sound needs here to portray something? Is there, you know, I mean, the orchestra parts might say piano, right? Or P, which is the Italian word for softly. And but what does that mean? Is it soft like anemically soft? Is it soft like tender? Is it soft like transparent? So there are so many ways that a sound can occur. And so when I have this vision in my head of what the end result needs to be to communicate the composer's intentions, um, I am starting by giving physical information, right? So it's by gesture, and when I'm on the podium, the most important thing I do is what they call a prep beat. So this is the beat before the music that shows the tempo, meaning the speed, and hopefully gives the information or the musician a lot of other information about what I'm asking for. So I'm doing this nonverbal activity, right? Well, they're responding with sound.
Uh-huh.
So, ironically, I'm the only person in a performance that doesn't make a sound. Um, and so I'm giving this physical information that incites an oral response. What happens then is a very complex but very rapid process where I'm hearing what's coming to me from the orchestra as they respond to my gesture. And then I'm comparing that to my vision and seeing how those relate to each other. From there, yeah, obviously, especially in early rehearsals, there's probably a disparity there, at least at some level, right? And that no matter how fine the musicians are, it doesn't, it's just that's just the process of rehearsing. And so then I'm hearing what's happening, comparing it to the vision in my mind, and then saying, okay, how do I bring these two things closer together? Is it me, right? Do I need to change the character of the physical information that I'm giving? For example, if I want it to sound soft and I'm using a large gesture, well, those two things do not match, right? And
Uh-huh.
so it's not encouraging to an orchestra to play softly if I'm up there flapping around, like a, large waterfowl or something, right? So then I have to say, okay, first, what am I doing? Am I truly physically communicating the sound that I want? If not, okay, I need to adjust. Um, and then the next step is, okay, if I'm in alignment with my vision, physically as well as mentally, then what's happening that I can coach in the ensemble, right? Is it that everyone's playing too loud, or only the woodwinds are playing too loud, or only the violins are playing too loud, or only the brass are playing too loud? Okay, well, then I can use a small gesture without stopping the music to indicate to them, okay, let's have just a little quieter, please. And I can balance that way. I can also, do things like, um, I'm trying to think, just in rehearsal last night, for the Verity, you can also invite something to be louder, right? If there's a line that you want to have more importance, you can encourage that. Um, so there's that, and then the trick of this is this process of giving information, hearing what actually is happening, comparing it to your vision, and doing something about it happens multiple times a second, right? So this is a very rapid process that, as a conductor, you really have to be able to manage, because one of the things that I find in some of my colleagues is that I'm not convinced they're actually hearing what's happening in front of them, right? They have a vision and they're giving physical information, but
Sure.
I'm not completely convinced that they're hearing what's actually going on in front of them as opposed to just what's in their head. And so that's a very complex process that happens, as I mentioned, you know, every second. I mean, many times. That's what a rehearsal is. You're on sort of like hyperactive listening, and
And if I can
it's
interject,
yeah,
you're listening to this large, large group of sounds. So you're not only listening to the whole ensemble together, but you're also trying to focus in on individual contributions.
yes. That's right. That is definitely part of it. And learning to understand, okay, let's say, I mean, I'm looking at a first violin section, right? Whatever, 12, 14, 16 violins, depending on the orchestra. And I need to understand also individually how those players are doing and what their contributions are. Because especially, for example, where I'm music director, it's my responsibility that for the care and feeding of the orchestra, which means understanding people's successes and struggles at the same time. So yes, there is definitely a sense of understanding individual contributions in this context, which, for example, in this piece that I'm conducting this week, is about 150 people.
Oh my.
Now it's obviously with a gigantic chorus that's not that's positioned behind the orchestra, so they're not that close to me. Hearing individual voices out of that is difficult, if not impossible. But in the orchestra, and who are closer to me, that is certainly part of the responsibility, is to understand the individual and the collective at the same time.
And I'm very curious as to how to get the attention of one person or one performer who's maybe a little off tune or a little too fast. How do you make sure that they see you and you can gesture specifically to one person?
Well, there are a couple different ways this works. Hopefully, they are attentive to me, and they are positioned in a way that obviously they're facing me, and are looking up from their part enough that they can engage with me, so that I don't have to do anything really specific to get their attention to make a request of them.
Like throw a
Uh,
tennis
it,
ball at their head.
yeah, right. Um, um, but there's also this phenomenon that I find very interesting, that if someone's not watching you, if you just continually stare at them,
Oh,
eventually they will engage with you,
I've
right?
heard about that technique.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure there's a name for it. I have no idea. But if that's the case, if there's a musician I'm trying to get in touch with, non-verbally, um, I will just continue to look at them
Yeah,
until they look at me. And then there's a realization, that, oh, okay, I need to be a little more engaged here, right? Because he
sure.
was looking at me directly, looking for my eyes, and I was not there. And I'm not saying this in a derisive way, right? Maybe it's a hard passage and they needed to really be kind of looking at every note for a moment. But that tends to work pretty well. If you're not successful in that, which happens sometimes, then you can stop and give certain coaching, to the orchestra, or make specific requests of them, and that's part of it. But in general, orchestras vastly prefer conductors who are able to give the information physically instead of talking all the time, because they're there to play, not listen to you talk.
So then that's, excuse me, how you got the attention of one person. Say you want to have one section, like all the brass, or
Hmm.
to respond to you. How do you communicate to a subgroup? Because
Mm.
at each of one of them individually.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's some complexity to that, and that the way that these instruments operate, meaning the technique that is used to play them, varies from section to section. So, for example, with strings, they have a bow that they're putting on the string, and they have a lot of control over exactly how that bow starts to move, at what speed, the pressure they're putting on the string, et cetera, right? So that invites a certain gestural vocabulary. Winds, for example, let's say, especially double reeds like the oboe, bassoon, the attack is much more immediate, right? Because they have to pressurize so much air through that small reed to make the sound, that they can't just go wah, right? It just doesn't operate that way. So there's always a little front to the sound. So it's D, right? And so that obviously that requires me to gesturally communicate a little bit differently, if I want them to sound the beginning of a chord altogether. Well, I can't give some wishy-washy gesture, because then they'll all enter at different times, and it's my fault. I did not give them the proper information. So I have to be a little more articulate with them, so that they know exactly where to place the note. Um, there are also a number of things that are just very simple, kind of international sign language gestures. And I don't mean actual sign language, right? Like in the linguistic idea. But for example, if I hold up my hand with my palm to you, what does that mean?
Oh, well, that means stop, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. So we understand that as stop, right? Or if I'm doing that and maybe my palm is not straight out to you, but I'm sort of pushing it down, like I'm depressing something. Well, that to most people means quieter, less, right? Whereas also, if I turn my palm up and I start encourage and moving it upwards, either fast or slow, that tends to invite more sound. So those are just some of the gestures that I can use to communicate, whether it's an individual and player, an entire section, the entire ensemble. Those are things that are tools that I very regularly use.
Nice. Well, that brings us to another point that I had, or another question maybe about gesturing. Now, those are the most obvious gestures that most of us know or we can generally figure out without having any lessons on working with you. But you know, I was thinking about your gesturing. Now, those are the simple ones. It's got to be extremely complex motion that you're engaged with. And can you tell me a little about your whole feeling, your stance on the podium, your general motion? Because I think I see that almost like a dance.
Mm, it is, China. When I think about the physicality of it, and I'm just sitting here right now reminding myself to sort of open my chest. I am a big Pilates fan,
Ah,
because that's something that has really aided my conducting a lot, and especially in my body language, right? Because that's, like I mentioned, I talked about the gestural vocabulary, what's happening in the hands and the wrists and the arms, etc. But it's also just about, like you mentioned, stance. It's also facially important that you're communicating. Um, but my stance on the podium certainly impacts the music. I can remember when I was just starting out as a conductor and I was conducting this overture that was very fast and bright and spry, and it felt very heavy from the orchestra. It just did not have the bright character that it needed. And I did a quick scan of myself, and I noticed that my feet were quite far apart, wider than shoulder width, right? And I thought, aha, I'm going to bring my feet closer together, like less than shoulder width apart. And the sound of the ensemble immediately changed as soon as I did that,
oh,
right? Because they saw me do that. They saw me stand up a little bit taller. I don't remember, but I'm guessing I sort of opened my posture a little bit, that I started being lighter in my feet, and that there was an immediate response without anybody saying a word. And so these things are very, very powerful. That these ways of body language, and body language is a fascinating thing, and something that, again, fairly early in my career, I read several books about, because it's such a critical way of communicating with the people in front of you when you're conducting. And again, it comes down to how much of this can I do without opening my mouth, without saying a word. Obviously, in rehearsal, there's some things I have to say, right? That just they need to be said or coached a certain way or explained a little bit. But my goal is to utilize every tool I have to communicate this information without speaking, because in the performance, that's what's going to happen, right? And then you go the next step of, how do I portray emotion physically, right? And that can be, if you want the sound to be really small, like, of just, I know people can't see me, but sort of using gestures that sort of make it more compact, or maybe you get the hands, or in my case, I'm using a baton, they vary in length. Mine's 14 inches long. And I got that in my right hand, but I can sort of cover the tip of the baton a little bit,
uh-huh.
or I can put a hand between the ensemble and the tip of the baton. That's very effective at getting them, to kind of focus on being quieter.
Hmm.
And then you come to facial expression. How can I? That's one of the greatest tools for portraying emotion, right? What do I want this sound to be? Do I want it to sound brave? If I say that word, I don't know. My body language reacts, right? If I say a word like that, if I want it to be sorrowful, something right there already, my hand has a reaction, my face has a reaction, my eyes are different, and those are things that communicate to people and very deeply in a way that you might not even be able to describe in words, but you're
Mhm.
connecting on a different level, on this nonverbal, intimate level of trust that is very critical to empowered performances.
That is so nuanced. And I can tell by your description that these are gestures that you've stumbled upon that you find successful. But can one say that this is a whole process that's s- not taught in conducting school, if that's a term?
Yeah, it is. I don't have a specific degree in conducting. They are available,
Oh,
and many of my colleagues do. Um, I went into this just pursuing in pursuit of being an excellent musician. That was my focus, right? And so I went a little bit different path before I turned to conducting. Um, but there are, look, here's my view on it. You can learn a conducting quote unquote technique, right? Just on the basics, depending on the meter of the music, how many beats to a bar? Is it 1 2 3 4, or 1 2 3 1 2 3, like in a waltz feel, right? And there are different gestures that you use to communicate that are somewhat universal, in training, and for what an orchestra will quickly understand. Obviously there's a thousand nuances within those gestures, but um it, a lot of this is passed down. A lot of the finer points of this are passed down, because conducting is a craft, and it's passed down. I had the fortune to have some excellent mentors, and then at a critical point in my life, be the assistant and protege of a very, very famous conductor. And you learn a lot by watching, right? And watching and seeing what is successful and also what is not so successful. um, because
sure.
all of us conductors are flawed at some level, and you can often learn a lot about what not to do, by watching something. So, and it's something that I still do today. If I see something on YouTube of a performance that I'm just happen to be listening to, I'll watch and see, oh wow, that was a really interesting gesture they made that incited something really great. And I might just steal that move. So it's a continual process. It's something I still think about today, about refinement of the craft, and how I give this information and portray music through my body.
I've never thought of it that way. That's interesting. And you said earlier you started out as a musician. What type of musician were you?
Uh, Piano was my main instrument and the only thing that I ever played at a professional level. I did study some cello when I was a kid, and then when I got interested in conducting in college, I started studying violin
Hmm.
because I wanted to understand better string technique. Obviously, there are more string players than anybody else in the orchestra, and so I I wanted to really gain some fluency in how to communicate with string players on a technical level. So that required me gaining a semblance of understanding of what they are doing, the physical mechanics of it, the possibilities of the instruments, the challenges that a double bass player might have that a violinist does not have, and vice versa. So that was very important part of my study. But really, it did all come down to years and years of piano lessons, that continued really through the end of my graduate studies.
Mhm. That's really quite fascinating because I can imagine how this personal inquiry into the instruments and how they function has helped you so much in being a conductor because, as you were describing quite earlier in the podcast, how you are paying attention to those nuances and you understand what each person is engaged with and what their challenges are in terms of the different nuances of their instrument.
To me, one of the greatest leadership moves there is to be able to speak to someone in their language
Oh,
and speak to someone in a way that they immediately understand that indicates that you understand them.
yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense.
And so if I can look at a string section and say something in a way that they don't have to translate what I'm saying to make it effective for them, that it's faster and they feel understood, right? They feel
Yeah.
like, oh, he gets us, right?
Yep.
And it's the same if I look at you know, the French horns and I make a request. Well, it's much more effective if I can use language that they use all the time, right? That's their lingo. And instead of saying something that then they have to say, well, what exactly does he mean? I don't know. Do we ask? Do we pretend we understand what he wants? You know, versus just me delivering actionable information immediately.
Mhm.
And of course, questions do always come up, clarifying questions, right? And you want that as a leader. But again, it, how great is it if you can speak to someone in their own language, even at an elemental or elementary level? That's a that's a big that's a powerful tool as a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes so much sense. And talking about listening to other people through their own language, you have a strong history of collaborating. And can you tell us a little bit about how your collaboration process works and who you enjoy collaborating with?
Collaboration was what got me into conducting,
Oh,
um, because I was an undergraduate and I was a hardcore pianist. And two things happened. The first was I sustained an injury to my right arm that made it clear that a career as a pianist was not possible. Simply because I could not sustain the hours and hours and hours of practice required to be a professional pianist.
mhm.
Um, Now, that doesn't mean I studied piano through grad school and spent, a good 6 hours a day at the keyboard for sure. But that's not enough to be, a very fine concert pianist, for example. Um, and then the second thing that happened was I realized that I didn't like spending all of this time by myself in a room with a piano.
Oh,
And that's really what it is, right? It's a pretty lonely thing.
mhm.
And a lot of people do that very well, or that a lot of people find kinship with the instrument in that situation. I didn't. And I began to realize that my greatest joy in music making was doing it with other people.
Oh,
And whether that was accompanying a singer or an instrumentalist or playing chamber music or whatever it might be, that's what brought me to life musically, making music with other people. And that's still the fuel to my fire today. And I'll give you an example. So this Verdi Requiem that I mentioned I'm conducting this week, large orchestra, large chorus, for vocal soloists, right? And so of course I've had some rehearsals with just the soloists this week. And I love tailoring the experience to their individual instruments and musicianship. Singers are very, very individual, right? Because they're not playing an instrument. The instrument is their body.
Sure.
And um, these small little things about the body, the vocal cords, the resonance chambers, etc. And I really get a kick out of listening to them, understanding what they might need vocally, whether they know it or not. Most of the time they know it, sometimes they don't quite know, but you can help them in a way that maybe they didn't even understand they needed. But I love that process. I just love it. And so collaboration for me is life, and collaborating off the podium. I have two music director jobs, and collaborating with the administrative teams in these institutions I find great joy in. And talking about ideas and how to advance the goals and the vision of the organization. And so collaboration is something for me that is really the lifeline, the lifeblood for me, and in really every area. And I love what happens when you have a good collaboration is that multiple people feel fulfilled.
That's true.
And to me, that's so much more interesting than just my own individual fulfillment, because that is fleeting.
Yep.
Um, Much more lasting and less temporal is a group feeling of fulfillment, because that spreads, right? That's something that's contagious. And I really, really love that.
And that is how you build a community too.
That's right. That's exactly right. You can't build community without people feeling like their voice makes a difference, their voice counts.
Yep.
And we see this in our culture right now, that there's a lot of talking going on, but there's very little listening happening.
And this is often a problem with people. And one of the bigger reasons why I wanted to do this podcast was to bring attention to the importance of listening and how it
Hmm.
builds a community and it creates a sustained environment to help a community move forward.
Yeah, that's right. I and this that was the really the impetus for my podcast too. Is, of course, as a conductor, the most important thing I do is listening. Right. I think from the conversation up to now that the listeners probably ascertained that without that I can't do any even the next step of my job. um but this does transfer to humanity, you know to humankind, and it's difficult for me to think of a more important thing, something that impacts every area of everyone's life and their interaction with others, whether that's small or large. To me, it all comes down to listening, whether that's my 5-year-old son, and when he's saying something, understanding the words he's saying, understanding what he's not saying, what's behind the words that he's saying, what is he communicating to me physically and with his body language? Does it match what he's saying? And understanding, you know, fully as possible what someone is communicating to you is the step to unlocking everything else.
Right. And with children, it's how to sustain an engaged relationship.
Absolutely. It's like any human, or not just human, animals, My family, we have two dogs. It's the same. Yeah, they everyone is better when they feel heard, because then they feel like they are empowered in themselves. And I don't know what greater gift you could give someone.
That's a beautiful way of putting it.
Thank you.
So, what's next on your calendar?
Next on my calendar, so I have performances here in Austin this weekend, and then I am back on. Oh, you'll get a kick out of this. Talk about listening. The Spoleto Festival USA, which is based in Charleston, North Carolina, where I'm music director of the orchestra. This is a 17-day festival in late spring,
Wow.
early summer. It's a multidisciplinary festival, over 100 performances in 17 days.
Whoa.
And all on the peninsula of Charleston. So every venue is within a 10-minute walk of others. And it's a very cool thing. Uh, I really have two dream jobs, honestly. And so one of the special things about Spoleto, as you mentioned in the introduction, is that it's a bespoke orchestra every year and formed um, by many of the most promising early career classical musicians in the world. And part of that involves, of course, then we have to hear auditions, right?
Sure.
And so last year we heard uh almost just under 500 auditions.
Oh my.
And out of that, we brought around 90 musicians to the festival. And so part of that is an audition tour. So we do accept recorded submissions. So there's no barrier to anyone um, applying. But we do this. We added a city, so now it's an 8-city audition tour. And so myself and my colleague, who's the manager of the orchestra, travel to these cities, and we hear, player after player after player in, 7-minute increments from, morning, noon, and night. And so after I finish performances here in Austin, I fly straight back to the audition tour for another 10 days or so to finish that. And, that's another interesting thing about listening is, obviously you're sitting here, and I think something that maybe some people don't understand is listening is very fatiguing when you're doing it well.
Uh-huh.
I once, I had a, kind of spate earlier on in my life of working in recording studios and in film a lot. And I remember a really well-known recording engineer describing to me, like, that's the sense that hearing is the sense that fatigues the fastest. And so
Oh.
you have to be very careful because, for example, if you're in a recording studio, well, a long working session does not mean that you're getting better at the end. You're probably getting worse, right? Because these senses start to fatigue, and you don't have the same sharpness in your hearing or your listening, or the same sort of critical critical, I was going to say critical eye, but critical ear to it. Um, and so this is, a very interesting thing, this audition tour, because it's hours upon hours of listening, and listening in a way that you can evaluate from a number of metrics. Is this person a fit for the orchestra? Or even, is this person a fit for the orchestra this year, or maybe not quite yet? Or maybe that's a really wonderful flute player, but does not match in sound what we need for the rest of the section. So it's another fascinating process, and honestly, it's a great joy also to hear these terrific young musicians come in, and they're all right at the sort of the end of their training and the beginning of their careers. And so there's this fire and energy and nervousness and passion and inexperience, and all of these things just manifest. And I always equate it to people when I'm trying to explain it, like, this is the difference of, like, college sports versus pro sports, right? Is like, and this is why I love college sports more, because there's a bit of unpredictability, right? You have a kind of high technical proficiency here, but the mistakes that happen are often unpredictable, right? And whereas I think professionals, it's very much ingrained, right? And there's a rhythm there that they've developed over those, thousands of hours. But with younger musicians, it's very exciting because there's just this energy that I really adore about it, and it's one of the things that makes that job a great joy.
I understand and I enjoy also that energy of the youth. It's captivating.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, the performances of the orchestra at the Spoleto Festival are very special just because of what I just explained, right? It's not that you
Sure.
can't hear finer performances of this music or more polished performances of this music. You certainly can. Go listen to the New York Philharmonic or some, whatever.
Yeah.
But there's a unique energy and drive that comes in these performances because of the youthful exuberance and feeling, and it also relies on me to communicate with them in a way that harnesses that and supports them when they need support, because they're not as experienced, or just, what, sometimes the best thing I can do is just not get in the way.
Well, Tim, that is so interesting, that whole comment of not getting in the way. But I unfortunately have to interject and get in the way because this has come to the end of our time together already. And
Oh, bummer.
I know, it's been so much fun. But hopefully we'll be able to do this again further along in your career.
Would
And
love to. Yeah.
I would love to speak with you then. So thank you so much.
Thank you, China. Great to chat with you.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you for listening to this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And ask yourself, what is your version of silence? If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to chinablueart.com and please follow me on Facebook and at Instagram. Thank you.